In the dense, forgotten marshlands of coastal Georgia, where the Blackwater River bleeds into the Atlantic, the air hangs heavy with the scent of salt and decay. Here, Spanish moss hangs from ancient oaks like funeral shrouds, and the silence is broken only by the hum of insects and the slow, sucking sound of the tide. For over a century, this land held a secret, buried not in the soft, dark earth, but hidden in plain sight. It was a secret that waited patiently until the year 2023, when a land developer, clearing the overgrown acreage for a luxury housing community, made a discovery that would halt the project indefinitely. His machinery struck something hard, something unyielding. It was not stone, nor was it simple wood. It was a fence line nearly a quarter-mile long, constructed from weathered, darkened planks of a most peculiar shape. As archaeologists were called to the site, they uncovered a truth so macabre, so profoundly disturbing, that it seemed to belong to the darkest pages of a Gothic novel rather than the annals of American history. The fence, they determined, was built almost entirely from the disassembled planks of 19th-century coffins. This grotesque boundary once enclosed the grounds of a long-vanished institution known as the Hawksmoor Haven for the Wayward, a place history had remembered, if it remembered it at all, as a beacon of Christian charity. The discovery of the coffin fence, along with a newly unsealed cache of county records and private journals, forces us to re-examine this forgotten chapter. It is a story of three siblings who built an empire on the suffering of the vulnerable, a tale of systemic cruelty disguised as salvation. This is the macabre history of the Hawksmoors, a story that challenges everything we thought we knew about the shadows that linger at the edges of progress. This channel isn't for everyone. We delve into the stories that history has tried to forget, the truths that are often uncomfortable and deeply unsettling. If you are one of the brave souls who believes these stories must be told, then subscribe to our community of truth seekers. Hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you're watching from, as we join together to pull back the veil on the Hawksmoor Haven. The story of the Hawksmoor Haven begins not with a fence of coffins, but with a promise of sanctuary. In the tumultuous years following the Civil War, the American South was a landscape of profound dislocation and suffering. It was in this environment, in 1872, that Reverend Alistair Hawksmoor first arrived in the coastal estuaries of Georgia. He was a man seemingly forged for the times, tall and imposing, with a voice that could command a cathedral or soothe a frightened child with equal facility. His sermons were legendary, weaving together promises of spiritual redemption and practical salvation for those lost in the wreckage of the era. He spoke of a new kind of institution, not a poorhouse or an asylum in the traditional brutal sense, but a true haven. He called it the Hawksmoor Haven for the Wayward, a place where the destitute, the orphaned, and the morally adrift could find structure, purpose, and God's grace. Flanking him in this noble enterprise were his two siblings, a formidable and insular trio. Dr. Eleanor Hawksmoor, his older sister, was a physician, a rarity for a woman of her time. She was as quiet and precise as Alistair was flamboyant and verbose. With her hair pulled back in a severe bun and her gaze analytical and unervingly direct, she was to be the guardian of the residents' physical health. The youngest, Silas Hawksmoor, was the practical foundation upon which Alistair's vision was built. A man of few words and a disposition as hard as the local granite, Silas was the manager, the enforcer, the one who would handle the logistics of turning his brother's divine inspiration into a functioning reality. Together, they purchased a vast, isolated tract of swampland, far from the prying eyes of any major town. There, using funds from a mysterious inheritance and a growing flock of wealthy donors captivated by Alistair's charisma, they built the haven. The main building was a severe Gothic revival structure of dark brick and steep gables, its tall, narrow windows resembling the watchful eyes of a predator. While from a distance it possessed a certain austere beauty, up close it felt more like a fortress than a sanctuary, its very architecture designed for containment rather than comfort. The public, however, saw only the promise. Newspapers praised the Hawksmoors' selfless charity. Wealthy patrons from Savannah and Charleston lauded Reverend Alistair as a living saint. The Hawksmoor Haven was born, a grand and noble experiment in Christian compassion, standing alone against the encroaching wilderness, its dark brick walls promising a new life to all who entered. To understand the darkness that would eventually consume the Hawksmoor Haven, one must first understand the desperation of those who sought refuge within its walls. The late 19th century was a merciless time for the vulnerable. The Haven became a magnet for society's cast-offs, a final destination for those with nowhere else to turn. They were predominantly young women, many of them Irish or Eastern European immigrants, cast out by their families for the shame of a pregnancy out of wedlock. They were orphans, children left parentless by war and disease, their small hands already calloused from labor. They were the desperately poor, entire families who had lost their farms or livelihoods, arriving with little more than the threadbare clothes on their backs and a hollow look of despair in their eyes. Their vulnerability was their defining characteristic, and it was this vulnerability that the Hawksmoors would learn to exploit with chilling efficiency. Consider the story of a young woman named Alara, a composite drawn from the fragmented accounts found in recovered letters. She arrived at the Haven in the spring of 1878, a girl of 17, pregnant and disowned. Like all new arrivals, she was brought before Reverend Alastair. He would speak to her not of condemnation, but of rebirth. His voice, a hypnotic baritone, would wash over the new arrivals, promising them that by surrendering their old, sinful lives, they could be remade. This surrender was absolute. Upon entry, residents signed contracts they could barely read, ceding any property they possessed to the Haven. More importantly, they signed over their autonomy. Their days were governed by a rigid schedule set by Silas. Pre-dawn prayers, 12 hours of hard labor in the laundry, the fields, or the sewing rooms, followed by an evening meal of thin gruel and another mandatory sermon from Alastair. Communication with the outside world was forbidden. The Haven was to be their entire world, the Hawksmoors their new family. Alastair framed this oppressive system as a spiritual crucible. In a pamphlet distributed to donors, he wrote, "We do not coddle the fallen, for a soul cannot be strengthened by comfort. It is through toil, through obedience, through the stripping away of pride and worldly attachment, that they are purified and made whole again in the eyes of the Lord." For Alara, and for hundreds like her, the imposing brick building was not a sanctuary, but a prison with a pious warden. The initial feeling of relief at having found a roof and a meal quickly curdled into a gnawing dread. The work was bone-breaking, the food barely enough to sustain them, and the psychological control total. They were trapped, isolated by geography and by the legal documents they had signed, their very identities being systematically erased and replaced by a single monolithic purpose: to serve the Haven. For the first few years of its operation, the Hawksmoor Haven maintained its pristine reputation. The isolation of the property and the iron-fisted control of Silas Hawksmoor ensured that no stories of the grim reality within its walls reached the outside world. But evil, no matter how carefully managed, has a way of seeping out. The first signs of trouble, the first cracks in the facade of benevolence, appeared in the form of an alarming number of small, unmarked graves accumulating in the Haven's modest cemetery. By 1880, a conscientious local doctor named Abram Walsh, who occasionally tended to the more affluent families in the county, began to notice a disturbing pattern. The official death certificates emerging from the Haven, all meticulously signed by Dr. Eleanor Hawksmoor, cited common but frequent causes: consumption, influenza, childbirth complications. Yet the sheer volume was staggering, particularly the mortality rate among infants born within the Haven's walls. The numbers defied all reasonable explanation, even for the harsh standards of the era. Dr. Walsh, a man of science and quiet conviction, paid a visit to the Haven, requesting a consultation with Dr. Hawksmoor. He was met, instead, by the Reverend Alastair. In the grand wood-paneled study, with sunlight struggling to penetrate the tall, narrow windows, Alastair turned the full force of his charisma upon the concerned physician. He spoke with sorrowful gravitas about the wretched state in which their residents arrived. "My dear doctor," he lamented, his voice resonating with practiced empathy. We are not a hospital for the healthy. We are a last resort for the broken. These poor souls come to us already ravaged by poverty and disease. We offer them comfort and dignity in their final days. Is it not a mercy? When Dr. Walsh pressed the issue, mentioning the infants, Dr. Eleanor Hawksmoor herself appeared. She was a chilling presence, her clinical detachment a stark contrast to her brother's theatricality. She produced her ledgers, pages upon pages of immaculate, precise handwriting detailing each case. The records were flawless, a testament to a methodical and scientific mind. She explained in cold academic terms the concept of maternal privation and its inevitable impact on infant viability. Her argument was so logical, so thoroughly documented, that it was nearly impossible to refute. As Dr. Walsh prepared to leave, unsettled but without concrete evidence, he had a final, brief encounter with Silas Hawksmoor near the main gate. Silas, leaning against a post, his face an unreadable mask, simply said, "A man's reputation is a fragile thing, Doctor. Best not to trouble it with baseless speculation." The words were spoken softly, but the threat was unmistakable. Dr. Walsh retreated. He had a family and a practice to protect. The cracks in the Haven's wall had been expertly plastered over by the united front of the Hawksmoor siblings, the charismatic leader, the methodical specialist, and the practical enforcer. The world would continue to believe in their goodness, while the small, unmarked graves continued to multiply in the damp Georgia soil. To truly comprehend the horror that unfolded at the Hawksmoor Haven, one must step inside the domain of Dr. Eleanor Hawksmoor, the infirmary. Situated in the west wing of the main building, it was a place spoken of only in fearful whispers among the residents. Unlike the rest of the Haven, which was often dusty and worn from endless labor, the infirmary was unervingly clean. The floors were scrubbed bare, the air smelled of carbolic acid and bleach, and the white-sheeted cots were arranged in stark, geometric rows. But this was not the cleanliness of healing. It was the sterility of a laboratory. This was Eleanor's kingdom, and within its walls, her true nature was given free rein. She was not a healer. She was a collector of data, a dispassionate observer of human decay. Her perverted form of medical science was not aimed at curing illness, but at studying it in its most raw and agonizing forms. The vulnerable population of the Haven was, to her, a perfect, self-renewing supply of test subjects. Her treatments were a ghastly parody of medicine. For a resident suffering from exhaustion and malnutrition, she would not prescribe rest and better food. Instead, she would meticulously document their deteriorating state, measuring their weight loss, their slowing heart rate, their cognitive decline, all noted with the detached precision of a botanist studying a wilting plant. She experimented with varying levels of starvation, testing the absolute limits of human endurance. For the young mothers who gave birth in her infirmary, she provided no comfort, only observation. She saw their pain and fear as mere biological responses, worthy of notation but not compassion. The high infant mortality rate that had alarmed Dr. Walsh was no accident. In many cases, it was an outcome she deliberately facilitated, studying the effects of maternal distress and malnourishment on newborns. Her work was a systematic, cold-blooded exploration of suffering. A former nurse, who fled the Haven in terror, and whose testimony was only uncovered decades later in a sealed court deposition, described Eleanor in a way that chills the bone. The nurse wrote in a secret journal, "When a soul would pass in the infirmary, the Reverend would speak of God's will. Silas would see to the box, but the doctor she would only watch. She watched them fade not with pity or even sadness, but with a collector's eye, as if she were capturing a rare butterfly for her collection. I saw her smile once, a small, tight thing, as she noted the exact moment the light left a young man's eyes. It was the smile of discovery. The infirmary was not a place of recovery. It was the engine of the Haven's dark enterprise, the chamber where human lives were methodically and scientifically extinguished. Eleanor Hawksmoor, the brilliant physician, was the most monstrous of the siblings, for her cruelty was not born of passion or greed alone, but of a cold, intellectual curiosity that saw human beings as nothing more than specimens to be studied, used, and ultimately discarded. While Reverend Alastair was the voice of the Haven and Dr. Eleanor was its silent, scientific engine, it was Silas Hawksmoor who was its hands. He was the architect of the residents' daily misery, the ruthless manager who ensured that the institution was not only a place of control, but also a brutally efficient and profitable enterprise. Silas understood that his brother's sermons and his sister's experiments were meaningless without a system to sustain them. He transformed the Haven into a self-contained economy built on a foundation of slave labor. The sprawling grounds were not for quiet contemplation, but for relentless production. Under his unforgiving supervision, the residents toiled in the fields, cultivating cash crops that were sold at market. They operated a large-scale commercial laundry, cleaning linens for wealthy families and hotels in distant towns, the profits flowing directly into the Hawksmoors' coffers. They worked in sewing rooms, producing garments for sale, their fingers raw and their backs aching. Silas's genius for logistics was matched only by his cruelty. He instituted a system of surveillance that turned the residents against one another, offering small privileges, like an extra piece of bread, to those who would inform on their peers for any infraction, no matter how minor. Whispering after lights out, pausing too long in the fields, a moment of defiant eye contact. All were reported and all were punished. And the punishments were Silas's specialty. His chosen method was the reflection room, a name that was a cruel euphemism for the 6 lightless, windowless cells in the basement of the main building. Here, transgressors were thrown into absolute darkness for days at a time, with only bread and water to sustain them, the sensory deprivation designed to break their will completely. But Silas's most critical role was in managing what the Hawksmoors chillingly referred to as departures. When a resident finally succumbed in Eleanor's infirmary, it was Silas who handled the aftermath. He oversaw the construction of the cheap pine coffins in the Haven's workshop. He filed the death certificates that Eleanor prepared. He managed the quiet, hasty burials in the ever-expanding cemetery, ensuring they happened at night, away from any potentially observant eyes. He was the master of the silent, grim logistics of death. He ensured that the deceased had no lingering connections to the outside world, that no grieving family would ever come looking for them. They had entered the Haven as forgotten souls, and it was Silas's job to ensure they remained forgotten in death. He was the practical gear that made the entire horrific machine turn. Alastair brought them in with promises of heaven, Eleanor processed them through a living hell, and Silas made sure the bodies were disposed of and the profits were counted. He was the grounded, ruthless enforcer, the man who knew where all the bodies were buried because he was the one who had put them there. The carefully orchestrated world of the Hawksmoors, sealed off from scrutiny by miles of swamp and a wall of lies, was impenetrable from the outside. The truth could only be unearthed by someone who managed to get inside. In the autumn of 1888, that person arrived. His name was Thomas Finch, a young and ferociously ambitious journalist from a prominent New York newspaper. He was dispatched to the South on what he considered a fluff piece, a profile of the sainted Reverend Alastair Hawksmoor and his celebrated Haven, a story meant to inspire readers with a tale of charity and redemption in the recovering South. Finch arrived with a healthy dose of northern cynicism, but he was, initially, taken in. Reverend Alastair was every bit as captivating as the legends claimed. He was eloquent, charming, and radiated an aura of profound moral authority. He toured Finch through the bustling laundry and the orderly fields, presenting a community humming with productive, purposeful energy. Dr. Eleanor spoke intelligently about her progressive methods for managing public health in a closed community. And Silas, though grim, seemed to be the epitome of no-nonsense efficiency. But Thomas Finch was, above all else, an observer. And, as the days wore on, he began to see things that didn't fit the pristine narrative. He saw the pervasive, unspoken fear in the eyes of the residents. They moved with a listless, shuffling gait, their faces gaunt and their bodies thin beneath their coarse uniforms. They never met his gaze directly, their eyes always downcast. He noticed the unsettling quiet of the place. For an institution supposedly housing dozens of women and children, there was no laughter, no chatter, no sound of play. The silence was thick, oppressive, and unnatural. He saw the fortress-like quality of the haven, not as a symbol of protection from the outside world, but of containment for those within. The gates were always locked. Guards, loyal men handpicked by Silas, patrolled the perimeter. This was not a place one could easily leave. His journalistic instincts, honed on the crime-ridden streets of New York, began to scream that something was deeply wrong. The official story was a beautiful tapestry, but he was starting to see the frayed, dark threads at its edges. The more Alastair preached of salvation, the more Finch saw damnation. The more Eleanor spoke of health, the more he saw decay. The more Silas enforced order, the more he felt the presence of a suffocating, brutal tyranny. Thomas Finch's assignment was to write a story of saints, but he was beginning to suspect he had stumbled into a den of monsters. He decided to extend his stay under the pretense of needing more time for his article. His real investigation had just begun. And for those of you who have stayed with this story, who recognize the importance of unearthing these difficult truths, I want to ask you to take a moment to support our work. If you believe these histories need a voice, please like this video and share it. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the discoveries that are yet to come. The deeper we go, the darker it gets. Thomas Finch began to operate in the shadows, his official interviews with the Hawksmoors serving as a cover for his clandestine investigation. He would walk the grounds at dusk, his journalist's notebook filled with seemingly innocuous observations that were, in fact, a catalog of damning evidence. He started with the cemetery. The official records, which Eleanor had so proudly shown him, listed just over 100 deaths in the haven's 16 years of operation. But as Finch paced out the cemetery, counting the simple unmarked wooden crosses, he found nearly double that number. The earth was crowded with the dead, a silent testament to a lie of an epic scale. The discrepancy was his first piece of solid, quantifiable proof. His breakthrough came not from a document, but from a human connection. He managed to earn the trust of an elderly resident named Arthur, a former blacksmith who had been at the haven for over a decade. Arthur's spirit was broken, but a spark of defiance remained. In hushed, fearful conversations behind the workshops, Arthur became Finch's window into the haven's secret life. He spoke of the fated ones, residents who were worked until they collapsed, then taken to Eleanor's infirmary, never to be seen again. He described the muffled screams that sometimes echoed from the infirmary's wing late at night, sounds that all the residents learned to ignore for their own safety. He told Finch about Silas's reflection rooms, and how men who went in for a day came out seemingly aged by a year. It was Arthur who, with a trembling finger, pointed Finch towards a greater, more tangible secret. He spoke of a young woman, a gifted writer named Agnes, who had kept a diary. She had tried to escape 2 years prior, but was caught by Silas's men. She was taken to the infirmary and faded within a week. But Arthur believed she had hidden her journal somewhere before she was taken. Acting on Arthur's whispered directions, Finch searched a loose stone in the foundation of the old chapel. There, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small leather-bound diary. Agnes's words were a voice from the grave, a horrifying confirmation of everything Finch had begun to suspect. She described the systematic starvation, the psychological torture, the cold, analytical cruelty of Dr. Hawksmoor. It was in this diary that Finch found the most chilling description of his siblings. Agnes had written, "They are not 3 people, but a single 3-headed serpent. Alastair is the hypnotizing gaze that draws you in. Eleanor is the venomous fang that poisons your body and soul. And Silas is the coiled muscle that crushes you, ensuring there is no escape." The journal transformed Finch's suspicions into certainty. He was no longer just a journalist writing a story. He was a witness for the dead, and he now held their testimony in his hands. Armed with the cemetery count and the harrowing words from Agnes's diary, Thomas Finch began to dig deeper, not into the history of the dead, but into the finances of the living. He knew that cruelty of this magnitude was rarely without a motive beyond simple sadism. There had to be a logic, a horrific rational system beneath the surface of the chaos. He shifted his focus to the contracts the residents signed upon their arrival. Pleading a need for details to enrich his article, he persuaded a suspicious but still prideful Alistair to show him copies of the paperwork. Under the guise of admiring their thoroughness, Finch spent hours poring over the documents. There, buried in the dense legal jargon, he found it. 2 clauses, present in every single contract. The first was the expected transfer of any and all personal property to the haven. The second was far more sinister. Each resident, upon signing, was unknowingly enrolled in a life insurance policy, a modest sum, but significant when multiplied by hundreds of souls. The sole beneficiary of every policy was, of course, the Hawksmoor Haven. The entire operation snapped into focus with sickening clarity. It was a human rendering plant, a factory of death designed for maximum profit. Alistair's charismatic preaching was the recruitment arm, drawing in a steady supply of vulnerable, disconnected individuals, the perfect victims, whose disappearance would go unnoticed. The brutal labor enforced by Silas was not just for the profit from crops and laundry. It was designed to weaken the residents, to break them down physically and mentally, making them susceptible to illness. This prepared them for the final stage. Once a resident was sufficiently broken, they were sent to Dr. Eleanor's infirmary. Her treatments were not medical care. They were the final, managed phase of the process. She would oversee their decline, ensuring their death appeared natural enough to be signed off on a death certificate, thereby allowing the haven to claim the life insurance payment. It was a perfect, monstrous cycle. Bring them in, work them to the brink, transfer them to the infirmary for the final, fatal treatment, collect the insurance, bury the body, and then use the reputation of the haven to attract the next victim. The 3 siblings each played their indispensable part. Alistair was the master of acquisition, Eleanor was the master of liquidation, and Silas was the master of operations, ensuring the machinery ran smoothly and silently, with no external leaks. The haven wasn't a charity that had gone wrong. It had been designed this way from the very beginning. It was a cold, calculated, and terrifyingly successful business model, where the raw materials were human lives and the final product was profit. Thomas Finch now understood the why. He understood the depraved economic engine that drove the Hawksmoor Haven. But there was one more secret, a final, visceral piece of the puzzle that Arthur, his elderly informant, had hinted at. He had spoken of Silas's strange thriftiness and of forbidden zones at the far edges of the property. "He wastes nothing," Arthur had whispered, his eyes wide with a terror that Finch didn't yet comprehend. Not even the boxes. Following a crudely drawn map from Arthur, Finch waited for a moonless, rain-swept night. He slipped out of his guest quarters and made his way toward the western perimeter, deep into the marshy swampland that bordered the property. The air was thick and foul. He was in a part of the haven he had never been shown, a place the residents were clearly forbidden to go. After a half-hour of struggling through mud and thick undergrowth, he found it. It was a fence. It stretched out into the darkness in both directions, a crude and formidable barrier. At first, it just looked like a rough, mismatched collection of dark, weathered planks. It was ugly and utilitarian, a stark contrast to the wrought iron fence at the front of the property. But as he drew closer, his lantern light playing over the wood, a cold dread began to crawl up his spine. The shapes were wrong. The planks were not uniform. Some were wide, some narrow, but many shared a distinctive, unnerving hexagonal shape. He ran his hand over the rough surface of one plank and his fingers caught on a small rusted metal plate, its inscription long since corroded into illegibility. He moved the lantern further down the line and saw it clearly. He saw the unmistakable tapered form of a coffin lid, repurposed as a fence post. He saw the side panels with their telltale beveled edges, nailed horizontally as rails. He stumbled backward, his mind reeling, the full incomprehensible horror of the scene washing over him. This wasn't just a fence. It was a necropolis, a wall built from the desecrated remains of the haven's victims. Silas, the practical, ruthless manager, in an act of supreme, ghoulish pragmatism, had seen no reason to let good pine go to waste. After the bodies were removed for their quiet burial, the coffins were unearthed, disassembled, and their planks used to build a fence. The very vessels that had carried the dead to their graves were being used to imprison the living. It was an act of desecration so profound, so utterly contemptuous of human dignity, that it defied reason. This fence was the ultimate symbol of the Hawksmoors' philosophy, that the people who came to them were not human souls to be saved, but resources to be consumed, used, and recycled, down to the very wood of their coffins. The image of the coffin fence was burned into Thomas Finch's mind. It was the physical manifestation of the Haven's evil, a tangible piece of evidence that could not be explained away by charisma or falsified ledgers. He knew he could no longer play the part of the fawning journalist. The time for subterfuge was over. The time for confrontation had arrived. With Agnes's journal tucked safely in his coat and the memory of the fence fueling his courage, he marched to Reverend Alastair's study the next morning. He found all three siblings there, as if they were expecting him. The air was thick with tension. Finch didn't waste time. He laid out his accusations. His voice steady despite the hammering in his chest. He spoke of the doctored death records, the impossibly high mortality rate, and the life insurance policies. He spoke of the systematic starvation and the testimonies of the residents. Reverend Alastair listened with a practiced look of paternal disappointment. When Finch was finished, the Reverend sighed, a picture of sorrowful patience. "My dear boy," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "grief and desperation can give rise to the most lurid fantasies. You have an overactive imagination, fueled by the sad tales of broken minds." Finch then played his final card. And the fence. Reverend? The one on the western marsh. What fantasy explains a fence built from coffins? For the first time, Alastair's composure cracked. A flicker of something cold and venomous passed through his eyes before the mask of piety slammed back into place. Dr. Eleanor, who had been observing the exchange with the detached air of a scientist watching a reaction in a beaker, spoke for the first time. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "Your sentimentality clouds your judgment, Mr. Finch. You see malice where there is only practicality. Wood is wood. Your conclusions are based on emotional inference, not empirical fact." It was Silas who cut through the pretense. He had been standing by the fireplace, his powerful frame coiled like a spring. He took a step forward, his hand resting on a heavy iron poker. He didn't raise his voice, but his words carried more menace than his brother's sermons ever could. "Some stories," Silas said, his gaze locked on Finch, "are better left untold. For your own health." In that moment, Finch understood. He had not come here to expose them to their faces. He had come to sign his own death warrant. They would not let him leave this place with what he knew. The study was no longer an office. It was a trap. The three-headed serpent had been provoked, and now all of its heads were turned on him. His only thought was to escape. The pretense of civility shattered. Thomas Finch knew he had only minutes, perhaps seconds, before Silas and his men would ensure his permanent silence. He feigned a moment of contrition, pretending to be swayed by Alastair's words, and in that brief instant of hesitation from the Hawksmoors, he bolted. He burst out of the study, shoving past a stunned guard, and ran for his life. The Haven, once a place of slow, creeping dread, was now a scene of frantic, adrenaline-fueled terror. He could hear Silas's roar behind him, a sound of pure, unrestrained fury. He didn't dare head for the main gate. It would be sealed. His only hope was the swamp, the very wilderness that kept the Haven isolated. He sprinted past the cowed residents, their faces a mixture of shock and a strange, dawning hope at seeing someone finally defy their captors. He vaulted a low wall and plunged into the overgrown marshland at the back of the property, the same area where he had found the coffin fence. The hunt was on. He could hear dogs barking, the sounds of men crashing through the undergrowth behind him. Silas knew this land, and Finch was an intruder in a hostile environment. He ran blindly, mud sucking at his boots, thorny vines tearing at his clothes and skin. He fell, scrambled up, and kept moving, driven by pure survival instinct. His salvation came from an unexpected quarter. The local population, while intimidated by the Hawksmoors, were not entirely ignorant. They had their suspicions, nurtured over years of seeing healthy people enter the haven and only hearing rumors of their deaths. A small, informal network of fishermen and farmers who lived on the estuary's edge had watched Finch's movements with interest. As he stumbled out of the swamp and onto a muddy riverbank, a small skiff emerged from the reeds. An old fisherman, his face weathered like ancient leather, helped Finch aboard without a word and began to pull them silently down the waterway, away from the sounds of the hunt. This silent network of sympathizers passed him from one safe house to the next, until he finally reached a train station miles away, where he boarded a train bound for New York. Back in the safety of his newspaper's office, he wrote the story of his life. The exposé, titled The Coffin Fence Cannibals of Georgia, was a sensation. It was published as a multi-part series, complete with Finch's detailed sketches of the fence and excerpts from Agnes's diary. But the public reaction was divided. Many were horrified, but just as many, influenced by years of glowing reports, refused to believe it. The Hawksmoors responded with formidable force. They issued a thunderous public denial, with Alastair delivering a powerful sermon in Savannah, accusing Finch of being a diabolical liar and an agent of anti-Christian forces. They then filed a massive libel lawsuit against Finch and his newspaper, threatening to ruin them both. For a time, it seemed as though the Hawksmoors' wall of lies might hold. Thomas Finch's explosive articles, while scandalous, were initially just words on a page. The Hawksmoors' powerful reputation and their aggressive legal counterattack created a stalemate of public opinion. But Finch's exposé had done one crucial thing. It had drawn the unwavering attention of the state authorities. Reluctantly at first, and under immense public pressure, the governor of Georgia dispatched a team of state marshals and investigators to the Hawksmoor haven. The lead investigator, a hardened, skeptical man named Captain Blackwood, arrived fully expecting to find a case of journalistic exaggeration. He was met at the gate by a composed Reverend Alastair, who welcomed the investigation as a chance to be fully and publicly vindicated. The investigators began their work, and for days they found little. The haven was clean, orderly, and the residents were too terrified to speak. The ledgers, as Dr. Walsh had discovered years earlier, were immaculate. Blackwood was beginning to believe the Hawksmoor story. But Thomas Finch had provided the investigators with a map. On the third day, against the strenuous objections of Silas Hawksmoor, who claimed the area was unsafe swampland, Blackwood led a team to the western perimeter. And there it was, the Coffin Fence. The tangible, undeniable, grotesque proof. It stood as a silent, damning witness. The investigators, hardened men who had seen the worst of humanity, were visibly shaken. The discovery of the fence changed everything. It lent credence to Finch's wildest claims. The investigation now proceeded with a new and terrible urgency. Armed with a court order, they began the grim task of exhuming graves from the Haven Cemetery. Primitive as it was, the forensic science of the day was enough. Autopsies on the exhumed bodies revealed evidence of chronic, severe malnutrition, and in several cases, traces of opiate-based compounds not consistent with any recorded medical treatment. The financial investigators, meanwhile, unraveled the life insurance scheme, tracing the payments directly to the Hawksmoors' personal bank accounts. The facade, so carefully constructed over nearly 2 decades, crumbled into dust. State marshals arrested the 3 siblings. The trial that followed was a national spectacle. Newspapers across the country dubbed it the trial of the century. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating, built on the twin pillars of the Coffin Fence and the financial records. But the most powerful moments came from the human testimony. Arthur, the old blacksmith, took the stand, his voice trembling but clear as he described the reign of terror. The nurse whose testimony had been sealed for years finally spoke publicly of Dr. Eleanor's cold-blooded experiments. One by one, former residents, now free from the haven's grip, shared their stories of starvation, abuse, and loss. The nation listened horrified, as the true nature of the charitable institution was laid bare for all to see. The trial of the Hawksmoors siblings concluded in the winter of 1890. The jury, after deliberating for less than 2 hours, returned with a verdict: guilty on all counts, including numerous charges of manslaughter, fraud, and unlawful imprisonment. The courtroom was silent as the sentences were read. Reverend Alistair Hawksmoor, defiant to the very end, delivered an impromptu sermon from the defendant's box, condemning the court and the jury as sinners and blasphemers, promising them eternal damnation. He was a performer until the last, his charisma curdled into pure, unadulterated megalomania. Dr. Eleanor Hawksmoor remained impassive, her expression unchanged. She viewed the proceedings with a clinical detachment, as if she were a spectator at a particularly interesting, if flawed, scientific presentation. Her final statement to the court was not one of remorse, but of intellectual complaint, noting the unscientific and emotional nature of the evidence presented against her. Only Silas Hawksmoor seemed to grasp the finality of their fall. The practical man, the enforcer, was broken. He remained silent, his head bowed, the brute force that had sustained the Haven's operations finally extinguished. They were sentenced to life in prison, sent to a remote, high-security facility where their names and their story would, for a time, fade from public memory. The Hawksmoor Haven for the wayward was shut down by the state. The remaining residents, a few dozen traumatized and institutionalized souls, were dispersed to other, more conventional state facilities. They carried with them the deep scars of their ordeal, their stories largely lost to history, their suffering a footnote in the sensational trial of their captors. The property itself was seized by the state and abandoned. No one wanted the land. It was tainted, haunted. The great brick building slowly fell into ruin, its roof collapsing, its windows shattering, vines crawling up its walls like grasping fingers. The coffin fence rotted and was eventually swallowed by the aggressive growth of the marsh. For a century, the story of the Hawksmoors became a local ghost story, a whispered legend used to frighten children. The historical reality was too monstrous, too shameful, and it was gradually suppressed, buried under the weight of time and a collective desire to forget. The land held its secret, the dark earth remembering what the history books would not, waiting for the roar of a bulldozer to bring its macabre tale back into the light of the modern world. We return, finally, to the present day, to a tract of cleared land in coastal Georgia, cordoned off with yellow tape. We return to the archaeological team, carefully cataloging the last remaining planks of a fence built from coffins. The story of the Hawksmoors is not merely a historical curiosity, a Gothic tale from a distant, more brutal past. It is a profound and unsettling cautionary tale. It serves as a stark reminder of how evil can flourish, not in the shadows of alleys and dens of iniquity, but in plain sight, behind a mask of virtue, piety, and respectability. The Hawksmoors were able to perpetrate their horrors for so long because society wanted to believe in them. They offered a simple, appealing solution to the complex, messy problems of poverty and social dislocation. It was easier for the wealthy donors and the general public to believe in Alistair's promise of salvation than to confront the uncomfortable truth of the suffering that was being hidden behind his eloquent words. Their victims were the voiceless and the powerless, the very people society is most adept at ignoring. The story forces us to ask unsettling questions. How often do we still place our faith in charismatic leaders without scrutinizing the foundations upon which they build their empires? How often do we accept the benevolent mission statements of powerful institutions without questioning what happens to the vulnerable people behind their closed doors? The specific horrors of the Hawksmoor Haven may belong to the 19th century, but the dynamics that allowed them to happen, the abuse of power, the exploitation of the vulnerable, and the complicity of a society that prefers not to look too closely at its own darkness, are timeless. The forms may change, but the three-headed serpent of charismatic deception, methodical cruelty, and practical enforcement is a monster that rears its heads in every generation. It is our duty to remember the lost souls of the Haven, not just to honor their memory, but as a commitment to being vigilant, to questioning authority, and to listening for the whispers of those who suffer in silence. For the darkest chapters of history are not just stories about the past. They are warnings for the future. What do you think is the most important lesson from this story? And how can we ensure such atrocities, hidden behind a veil of righteousness, are never allowed to happen again? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story has impacted you, please subscribe to the channel. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an investigation, and share this video to help us ensure these vital histories are never again forgotten.